truth is something that is discursive in the sense that it's something that we negotiate, right? There's not just one truth. Your truth here in Canada might be true here, but that necessarily doesn't transpose into the context like in Africa, for instance. So truth is not something that is just one thing, right? It could be many, many things, right? And we are engaging discursively, ongoing around what that truth is and what it looks like.
That's a quick preview of my conversation this week with Dr. Sulaimon Giwa of Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. My name is Ben Charland. This is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Today's episode is fascinating to me, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But before I do, as always, wanted to put out the request for you to get in touch or to share, to spread the word, this show on social media or by word of mouth. Please tell your friends if you like a particular episode, share that online, or tell people to listen, and also give me feedback. You can send me an email at wogoshow@gmail.com. That's WOEGO show@gmail.com, or visit the website for all previous episodes and all episodes ongoing, wogoshow.com. Now, this conversation today is important to me because it exploded some of my presumptions that I walk into the room with when I'm interviewing someone. With Dr. Giwa, I assumed that he was enjoying Newfoundland, or at least I assumed that he thought, like I thought, that people in Newfoundland are really friendly and nice, and they are, to me. But in Dr. Giwa's experience as a gay black man living in St. John's, it can feel a little bit differently. And you'll notice I wasn't very comfortable with his response. I wasn't prepared for it. We loop back at the end and we talk a little bit more about it in depth. But at the beginning, I just wasn't ready for the question, and it made me understand when I'm interviewing someone how important it is to come to it with an open mind and not to assume that they share any of the opinions or ideas or presumptions about people that I might have. It's a pretty important lesson for me, and I hope that you get as much from this conversation that I did. Thanks so much. All right, Dr. Sulaimon Giwa, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Okay.
I've looked into a lot of your work, and I'm really fascinated by what you do. You're here at the School of Social Work.
Correct.
At Memorial University of Newfoundland.
Correct.
How long have you been here for?
About a year. I just actually finished my first year of a tenure track position.
So what do you think of it here in St. John's?
It's different from where I originally came from. So, but I'm getting used to it. It takes a while to kind of get adjusted to a new place.
Yeah.
And, so yeah, I'm kind of still acclimatizing and trying to get to know people and let people know the kind of work that I'm doing and how I can be of support to them in their particular work that they're doing within the communities, and how we can make the community much, much better.
Right. I find this a fascinating city. I've always loved St. John's. I've only been coming here for a few years now, but it's a beautiful city and really friendly people from what I can tell.
So I've been told.
And you're still new to it, but
yes.
But I really it's a very friendly and welcoming place from my vantage point, which is just as a tourist. But I have no idea what it's like to live here, which you've been doing for a year now.
Yeah.
But before we get to all that, I have got my first question, which is always the same. Dr. Giwa, what on earth is going on?
What is not going on? I think that a lot is going on right now, with the election of Trump and some of the alt-right kind of movement that is kind of springing out from that.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing the implications of that right now,
Right.
not necessarily just in the United States, but just globally as well, too. And interestingly enough, we're also seeing some of that happening here in Canada as well. Right. I think for the longest time, and I still think it's still the kind of sentiment that we have as Canadians, is that we're better than the U.S. in terms of some of the ways in which race politics plays out. And clearly that's not the case. And we're seeing the ramifications of that right now in Canada as we are in the United States. And also as the Black Lives Matter movement has shown us, in terms of what's happening with respect to black people, particularly young black men, unarmed black men who are being killed by the police agencies within the United States as well too. And we've seen some instances here as well too in Canada. I'm talking specifically about the case of Abdurrahman Abdi in Ottawa. I'm talking about Andrew Loku in Toronto, for instance, as well too. So I think the idea that we're better than Americans is not necessarily as as real and true as people would like to believe.
Well, and I think it's a bit of a red herring. I don't think that's really what we're talking about. I mean, if we're going to talk about racism and violence and the problems in our society, is it really that helpful just to say Canada compared to the United States? I mean, the problem is so much more nuanced than that. I mean, Canada is a big country. The United States is a huge country in terms of population. There are different cities and regions and populations, and in some contexts, Canada is a paradise, and in some contexts, the United States is also a paradise. And I think when we make such a comparison, like Canada is better, well, maybe according to one statistic, but maybe according to another, it isn't. And I think we're kind of missing the point. Why do you think that these problems are? I mean, I don't know if first of all, are the problems getting worse when we talk about racism? And second of all, if they are getting worse, why is that?
Wow, that's a big question. Are they getting worse? I mean, to be able to answer that question, you would probably need to look at statistics and see what statistics is saying about, from one era to another era in terms of how things are right now. My family immigrated from Nigeria to Canada when I was 11. So, if you thinking from that period from 1990 to now, I would say that my experience has been that racism continues to be what it is. There are instances and pockets of racism that we're seeing across Canada. And, my experience going through the high school, going through middle school, I experienced racism there, just as I've experienced racism when I was in college and universities as well, too.
Right.
So for me, I just see racism as a manifestation that just continues. It doesn't necessarily end. I think the ways in which we manifest racism in Canada is completely different than what we will see, if we're again comparing to United States, right? In the sense that, there's a sense of innocence that is attached to the racism that we kind of embody within Canadian context, where people might not necessarily be racist to your face, but in terms of when it comes to employment, you might see instances there because they might not employ visible minorities for whatever reasons they don't do that, right? We know from data that are coming out right now, particularly in the case of Ontario, where we've seen data that are showing us that young Black men and also Indigenous youth as well too are being streamed into not non-advanced courses or programs, right?
Okay.
And we also see in terms of when it comes to suspension rates, right? We've seen their numbers also really, really skyrocket there as well too. And also when it comes to high school completion and graduation, their number is very, very low. So, I mean, those are all instances, particularly when we look at institutions and see the ways in which they, implement their policies that they've created.
Right.
We've seen that it's actually having significant impact on racialized individuals, also indigenous individuals as well, too. So, is it getting better? I think that maybe we're having more frank conversations nowadays about the ways in which racism is happening. And I think, the idea of innocent racism that we see being played out within the Canadian context is being challenged more continuously. So I don't think necessarily that it's getting any worse. I don't think it's getting any better. I just think that the ways in which we're having the conversations about racism is different.
Maybe our perspective is shifting, or the lens through which we're looking at it is shifting as well. And I think, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem too, right? If we look at racism in the United States and Canada, it's the way that we are perceiving of this happening in the newspaper, in the 6 o'clock news, and how much of this is being the top story. And part of this is being driven by racialized politics in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. And if racialized politics is bringing those stories to the forefront, that doesn't mean that there are more of those stories. There could be less. Steven Pinker has done a lot of work to say that the world is actually becoming a more safe and secure and prosperous place by the day. But it looks the other way because the news and the stories that we tell ourselves are the opposite. But the problem, I think, with something like racism is that if it seems like it's getting worse, then that may actually make it get worse. Just that perspective may make things get worse. But you've done some really interesting work, and I've read a few.
If you don't mind me quickly, I just want to say that also I think perceptions of people who are racialized also matters in terms of the ways in which we conceptualize or we think about issues of race, right? So, of racism itself, right? So, visible minorities or racialized minorities themselves might also interpret racism as being something that is, on some level very, very important and is happening a lot, right?
Right.
Because of the experience that they're encountering on a day-to-day basis. So if for instance, let's use you as an example. So Ben Charland, I'm assuming you identify as being white. Your perceptions of how racism is in Canadian context
For sure.
might be completely different from, say, my experience of
Absolutely.
racism. So
Yeah.
you might think that it's not getting worse or it's not getting any better, I might think it's actually getting worse as a result of encounters that I'm having every single day, right? So when I step out of my
Right.
home as a black person, it begins,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Well, and I think further to that, I met a cab driver not long ago who was a black person in Canada driving a cab, and he said that he experiences racism every day, every single day. For me, as a white male living in Canada, racism can be something that if I don't pay attention to it, it's something that I have to be reminded of, that it exists. It doesn't happen to me. If I read a story about it in a newspaper, I sometimes will go, oh, right, that's how some people have to deal with life. And when I was talking to this cab driver, he was saying that every single day he gets some kind of comment or look. And the problem with that is that there may be things that happen in his life that really aren't anything, that racism isn't occurring, but because he's been racialized, it feels like it is. It feels like the world is conceiving of himself in that way. And that's what happens to me because I live my life as a white male. And of privilege, I don't have to deal with that. And so that when racism is existing, I might not notice it. Right. And what I wanted to go back to earlier is this: how do we define this term racism? I think it's really important because it's a very loaded word. It's been around for a long time, but it's changed. And what racism is has also changed. I mean, the kind of racism that I think we're talking about here isn't the kind of racism that maybe 100 years ago was prevalent, or even 50 years ago, name calling or actual discrimination in the workplace where someone would say, I'm not going to hire you because you're black, or you can't use this bathroom because you're from Asia, or whatever it is, right? The kind of racism we're dealing with now is systemic. So for someone that works in this field and does a lot of work about racism, and you also deal with sexuality too, and gender expression. But before we get into the talk about gender expression and LGBTQ rights, what is racism? Can we define that properly?
I mean, we can define it, but also I think it's important to keep in mind that racism is not just a single thing, right? So more and more we're seeing people, say racisms with an S at the end of it, right? To kind of reflect the manifestations of the different types of racism that could happen, right?
Okay.
So even as you were just saying, the ways in which we think about racism nowadays is not necessarily what we saw back in the 50s and 60s when talking about the civil rights movement, right? Where somebody might not hire you because you're black or whatever. But I think what is really, really important still there is that underneath all of that is manifestations of supremacy, white supremacy. So the idea of privilege and power and dominance is really, really central to the ways in which racism manifests itself, right? So even when we're trying to understand racism today, yes, again, getting back to the idea that, within Canadian context, there's this element of innocence that goes with how racism is being done, right? So people might not hire you because of X, Y, and Z, but all of that is still really about, maintaining the white race, right? The alt-right movement, when we see the ways in which they're actually, actualizing some of their sentiments or their ideas, right? It's really, truly silly about power, about white power, and maintaining that. And what gets lost when we, as white individuals, as the saying goes, don't actually fight back against some of the probably infusions of or influxes of immigrants that are coming in or refugees that are coming in into our countries, right? So really, at the crux of it, I think when we're thinking about racism, what we really need to understand is notions of dominance, privilege, and power, and how that kind of operates in our day-to-day lives, right? Because ultimately, that's what it's about.
Right.
Regardless of the ways in which we express our sentiment, it's really about trying to maintain a particular kind of ideology that supports our own way of life.
Right, of course. And I mean, of course, it's about power. And if we avoid that word, then we're really avoiding the crux of the issue.
That's it.
Because if it's not about power, then really, who cares? Right? And I think you use this word innocence, which I think is really important. And perhaps that's one thing that if we're going to talk about the separation between Canada and the United States, Canada maybe has just a sense of innocence that the United States broke a long time ago with the Civil War, emancipation, the the civil rights movement and the awful segregation that occurred in much of the southern states, right? They have dealt with this problem. It's been part of their story for a long time. In Canada, it's a secondary or tertiary story to the national myth, right? So I think there may be an innocence in Canada to us, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In fact, it might actually mask a problem more clearly and not allow us to deal with it head on, especially if it's a problem about power.
For sure.
So what do you think that, I mean, if we're going to talk about power, what are we talking about? Are we talking about economic power? Are we talking about cultural power, political power? I mean, obviously it's probably a mix of all of these things, but what's the best way to grapple with this problem?
I think you kind of hit it in the head, and I think it is all of that, right? So power is not just necessarily concentrated on a political level, but it's also economic, right? Because earlier we were talking about the fact that, I mean, going back to the example that I just illustrated around, young black men and their educational kind of experiences, and also indigenous youth as well too, and their educational experiences. If these youths are not able to actually stay in school and get the education that they need, get the qualifications that is going to get them a good job, then we're not really preparing them for the future, right? So in terms of actually influencing, society, trying to make change, trying to have a voice, all of that is gone, right? Because of the ways in which the education system is set up to actually kind of get rid of those bodies from those mainstream systems. So I think that, we are talking about economic power. We're talking about political power. We're talking about cultural power. We're talking about systemic power, right? Because again, it's funny because I was teaching my students, this past semester that I just finished, and about, some of the ways in which racism kind of, appear in Canada and the demographics of Canada. And I think, even this kind of ideology that, there's a lot of all these immigrants that are coming into the country and they're taking over and there's too many of them and so on. So when I showed a pie chart that actually shows, according to Stats Canada, that actually shows the breakdown of the country in terms of the race and, where they, who's more dominant in terms of, numbers, white people are still there. Black people are not taking over your country. Asian people are not taking over your country. The majority is still white people, right? In different, geographical contexts, like in Toronto, for instance, sure, you might see more ethnic people just by the nature of the ways the immigration patterns actually happen, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that white people are a minority within the whole context of Canada. So just putting things into perspective, I think is really, really important. And again, in terms of how we think about power, how we, manifest in terms of political, structural, economic, and that kind of stuff, those are all tied to the institutions and systems within which people are actually kind of tied up in, right? So if we're not careful about the ways in which we make policies and the implications of those policies on racialized bodies, those are the consequences that we see in the end, right?
Right. I think a lot of people would say that what the conversation we're having is identity politics, right? And this is a buzz phrase that's going around a lot, identity politics. But there's the word identity, which I think really is important. How do people identify in the Canadian census? A lot of people identify as Anglo-Saxon or African or Asian, Australian, whatever, European. But a lot of people identify as Canadian, which is a category that does exist, I think, in the census, but most people who identify as Canadian are in the St. Lawrence Valley, in Quebec, and a little bit in Ontario. If you're in Alberta, even if your grandparents and great-grandparents were born in Canada, you may not identify as Canadian as an ethnicity or as an identity. But this is changing, and it's really interesting to see how identities change. I lived in the UK for a while, and there was a certain sense that a British person could be Black, Indian, East Asian, Canadian, whatever, but British. But an English person or a Scottish or a Welsh person could not be. That those were racial identities, whereas a British person was more of a civic identity. And a Canadian can be kind of a civic identity, even though 200 years ago, a Canadian was a Canadien, like almost a person that had been here for a long time, had roots in Canada, and then maybe an Aboriginal person could be a Canadian person as well. But it was very limited in terms of this identity. But the identity of a Canadian or an American or a British person or a French person is exploding and changing with time. Do you think that that's part of the work that needs to be done, is to allow these identities to shift and evolve? Or do you think that that's a bit of a red herring as well?
I don't necessarily think it's red herring. I think similar to like all the other kind of isms that we've been talking about, I think that identity is something that is very fluid in the sense of how people identify themselves, right?
Right.
So it's not just one thing. I'm Nigerian by birth. I identify as Nigerian. I identify as being African, right? I also identify as being Canadian. I've been here since 1990. So I'm a Canadian citizen. So I think all that is fine, right? But I think one of the things that I take issues with, particularly when I've been hearing some of, more conservative kind of like, mostly conservative kind of like, ideas around identity politics and the critique of identity politics as a divisive tool, right? That doesn't necessarily bring, our country together. Even right now, if you listen to what's happening with Maxime Bernier, and he's talking a lot about, why we, getting solid into identity politics, when we should be thinking about, all of like, Canada and yada, yada, yada. I think, on some level, he's missing the point, right? It's not so much that, we're talking about identity politics as a way to kind of divide the country. It's about saying that, listen, there are certain populations and certain groups within Canadian context who, for the longest time, haven't had a fair share.
Right.
And how can we make sure that the playing field is leveled and equal for people to actually make ends meet, right? That's really what truly identity politics. It's not about saying, Africans or black people are better than white people, or white people are better than black people.
Or there's entitlement or anything like that.
Yeah. So it's about saying, listen, there are some populations and groups, for whatever reason, maybe because of policies that we've developed, maybe for a reason in the case of indigenous people, colonization, for instance, right? Because of all that's happened, they are in this bad position. How can we make sure that we begin to rectify the injustices of the past, right?
Yeah.
And also the other thing that is tied to identity politics is that people always say, well, it happened in the past and I was not part of it, so get over it. Well, no, we're not going to get over it, right? It's true that maybe you were not part of the problem, right? But you're still reaping the benefit of those problems.
Well, moreover, it's still in the DNA of our country, right? In our culture, in our country, in our national story. Colonization, for example, just as one aspect of identity politics, colonization is in who we are. And so we can't just say get over it and move on, because it's in us. And I think when you said earlier that this is about power, that really is the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of this easy argument that can be made by people like Maxime Bernier, who say, well, why can't we all just get along and be one people and move on from this? The more time we spend on these things, the less we're missing the point of the bigger picture, right? Well, unfortunately, if you end the identity politics conversation, just say, no, it's over, we've moved on, we've solved that problem, well, then you're not allowing power to shift.
That's it.
You're essentially crystallizing what already exists and ossifying it in time, where there is a hierarchy, a feeling of supremacy of white, black, Aboriginal, and you're missing the point, which is power. And I think that's really key in something that you said.
If I may also share it with you, also again going back to my class, I was actually teaching a course last term called Social Work and Social Justice, and in that course, it's really about just diversity issues, all isms that we've been talking about, and how it kind of also kind of appear within social work context, and how we can prepare our students to be able to deal with those kind of issues when they're on the front line. And one of the things that I make a conscious effort to do in all my classes is to situate myself social-politically, but also culturally in terms of my politics, right? So identity politics is something that is very central to me. A lot of my work that I do is really couched around identity politics, because I think that it's really, really important that we pay attention to that, right? There's a lot that is lost when we don't pay attention to identity politics and the voices of people that have been marginalized for so long. So, I identify as a black, gay man, right? And that's identity. I think that's really, really important. It's really core to who I am as an individual. So for somebody to say, just get over that and you find something else as a way to, you're really, really dismissing who I am as an individual and the ways in which I identify myself and, how I go from one space to another space within the world.
When you talk about identity politics, you're talking about something that is something that we all participate in. A lot of people who are critiquing the power structure of Western society will say that your identity does determine what things you can say and not say, right? So as a white male, it's pretty hard for me to talk about racism. I mean, obviously it's not hard for me to talk about it, but it's hard for me to lecture about it. It's hard for me to create legislation about it. That's why it seems hypocritical for someone like Maxime Bernier, who's a white male, in Canada to talk about racism and the problems of racism and identity politics when he really probably hasn't experienced it in his personal life. But does that preclude him from talking about it? Or are the only people who are qualified to talk about these things are ones who have the correct identity? Is there, and I guess the corollary to that is there a danger in saying that only certain people can talk about certain things? And I'm not saying you're saying that, but there are people who would say that as a white male, there are certain things that I just shouldn't write about or talk about, or I should get someone else to make the statement.
Just a quick point. On my last, kind of like in the last conversation that we were having, I think one of the other things that parallel that I wanted to make was around identity politics. And for me, it's also kind of, tantamount to the notions of colorblind, right? So when we hear a lot of people say like, oh, I don't see race, for instance, right? That statement itself is also very problematic, right? Because if you don't see race, that also essentially means that you don't see me as an individual, right? Particularly because of the visibility of my blackness. So if you don't see race, you don't see me, right? So this is why identity politics is really, really important. People might think like, oh yeah, I don't see race, I'm tolerant, I'm egalitarian, I'm all this stuff. But no. If you're all of that and you don't see race, you're really telling me that you don't really see me as a person, right? Yeah. So I think people just need to kind of think about that for a second and what that means, right? And now that also influences the ways they behave in society at large.
Well, and just to add to that, there's something to be celebrated there, right? I mean, if race becomes, or ethnicity or religion or whatever becomes something that we are blind to, then we're missing the opportunity. Yeah, we're missing the chance for diversity and your life story. It's interesting, the fact that you were born in Nigeria and moved to Canada when you were 11, right? It's an interesting experience that you've had, good and bad, for being a black man in Canada and having to deal with racism every day, but also being in a different context. I was a white man traveling across African countries 4 or 5 years ago and experienced what it was like to be a very, very different person. But regardless of the fact that would be bad or good, or we can critique it or what, that was interesting. Yeah. And if we were all blind to it, we would be, again, missing something, right? That is essentially human. Not to say that we can cut and divide us into different categories, but rather to say that if we can remove the power dynamic from it, we can celebrate diversity as something quite interesting and powerful, and an engine of prosperity and growth, perhaps, too. An engine of innovation,
Innovations,
right?
Yeah. Very true. And I think also, too, you raise an important question around, the role of white people within the centrality of, discussions around race, racism, and how that plays out. Right. And even within academia, this is something that we're still kind of struggling with to try to reconcile in terms of, should, white people be allowed to teach a course on diversity, for instance.
Right.
And I think you probably get, polar opposite answers in terms of some people say yes, some people say no. But from my perspective, I think that there is a place for white people within the discourse of race and racism, right? White people are being in situations where they've experienced this power for the longest time, so they know what it feels like to have that power, right? So I think that within the context of education, for instance, right, they can teach a course that is directly tied to ideas of race and talk about it from the perspective of power. Like, what does it mean for a white person to have power? How does power manifest itself in different spectrums of society at large? And how does it impact on people who are not white, right? That's not necessarily to say that they need to be talking about the experiences of people of color, right? Or racialized people, for instance, because as a white person, you don't have that experience. Just like I cannot speak to what it means to live in a white body, So I can only talk about the experiences of racism as a black person and how policies gets created and the ways in which they impact people in my community, and so on. So I think that there is a place for white people to be allies in that regard. But I think the question becomes, when you start moving into the terrain of like, trying to talk about the experiences of people who you have no idea about, I think that can be problematic.
Well, what about this word appropriation, which we talk about a lot, right? So if I'm in a restaurant that has Asian cuisine, but it's all white people serving, for example, and it's serving white customers, it feels like it's cultural appropriation, right? Whether it's yo sushi or something like that, and it's just white people serving white people, but it's a totally different kind of food, and we've just appropriated this to sell it for a big company, right? Or all other kinds of cultural appropriation. You have white male authors who write about the experience of a black female in a country they've maybe never been to. We talk about this as if it's some kind of a crime or a sin. Is it that, or is it an expression of creativity that we would rather someone of that milieu take on, right?
Another very good question. I think for me, on the question of appropriation, I think one of the things that is missing, again, tying it back to the idea of power, I think that's really also part of that.
Right.
So who gets to define or who gets to speak for somebody else?
Right.
I think it's the question that we're asking when it comes to appropriation, right? So in the case and we had similar instances, right, not too long ago in Quebec, where I believe a gentleman that was the leader or the head of the company. They were trying to put on a show about slavery and that stuff, and it wasn't really representative of black people in terms of their experiences, and eventually the show did not go on. It got shut down because of backlash from the community at large and everybody else in Quebec saying this doesn't make any sense, yada yada yada. And I think, again, for me, appropriation is really truly about voice. It's about power. It's about who's getting to define the narratives of those people that we are interested in talking about, right? It's fine if a white person want to write about, Africa, but I will question the legitimacy of the arguments that person will be making if that person hasn't really demonstrated any kind of particular investment within that particular continent, right? Or its people, right? It's one thing to be an outsider writing about people that are living there. It's another thing to actually live there and to be part of that people and the stories of those people.
Sure.
And then to maybe work in collaboration with those people to tell their stories.
Yeah.
That's different than somebody being in Canada and writing about Africa.
Right.
A place you have no idea about.
And I think anybody would see that as blatant. As so obvious that you can't. Even if it was a white person writing about another white person, but in a different country and context and time, we know that if you don't do your work and research and get behind it, that you're actually doing a disservice to your subject. In terms of academia, I know that this is a conversation. When you come across a paper in the social sciences or human sciences or the arts, does it matter who the author is and where they come from and what their name is and what their gender is, or does it only matter what they say and what their research is?
Ooh, very good question. I've seen in some cases where racialized scholars actually make a conscientious effort to only cite racialized authors. Okay. Right? And I think that's I think that's a good thing. I think part of the issue is that within academia setting, right, racialized people are not really well represented, right?
Right.
And we are part of the engine that is producing knowledge about, different experiences. And oftentimes, those experiences or realities are not really being cited by other academics or our voice is just really not there. So when a scholar, a racialized scholar, is making a conscientious effort to actually cite only racialized scholars, I think it's about trying to give voice to those scholars whose experiences have been kind of subjugated in the sense of not being well represented or not being cited enough or their ideas are not being taken up, right? So in that way, it could be a shifting of power. Okay. Right, to say, because everybody else that we cite are all white people, right? Sure. So it's about, giving more power to white people.
Absolutely. So. But you're talking about quantity, really. You're talking about the number of papers by people who are racialized, the number of people who are represented from groups that up to a certain point haven't been represented in academia. But I guess the question could also be one of not quality, but your perception of the piece. So if I were to hand you a paper right now about whether it was about racism or human rights or just a completely different subject in the social sciences, would it matter who the author is in your reading of that paper? Would the author's name and background and gender identity affect your reading of the paper?
I think that we should be careful not to make a false equivalency between race and necessarily intellect. I think it's possible that somebody who's racialized can also write a scientific paper or an empirical paper that is, well researched, well reasoned, well thought out.
Yeah.
And we can use that information however we want to use that information in our own research, right? So
Right.
this is not really a question about race and intellect and how that kind of gets played out.
No.
But I think, but it's also not to say that it's a carte blanche to say that, a racialized person, because that person identifies as being racialized, or because I know that individual or scholar to be racialized, that I'll be more likely to cite their work compared to somebody who's not, right? Again, it's not carte blanche. My citing of a particular source depends on the quality of the research that has been done. And if the research is sound,
Right.
then I'll cite the research.
Right.
But again, as I said, I'm also conscious of the fact that, within the academic spaces, there are academics of color who are also producing literatures and knowledges that
Right.
are not necessarily getting the kind of attention that they should be getting, right?
Right.
Because everybody's citing the same source, right? So if one person is being cited, a white author is being cited by, two people, and then another person picks up the paper and they're reading it and they want to cite the same two authors that already been cited, right?
Yeah.
So this is the way it kind of recycle itself, right?
Right.
So in that process, certain kind of knowledges, certain kind of individuals' identities, they get washed out, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody's citing the same author. So I think we need to be strategic in the ways in which we do that. So as I said to you, one particular academic that I can think of right now makes a conscientious effort to only cite academics of color. And in doing so, they are essentially speaking back to power to say, listen, we know what's going on within the academia world, and we are invested. So as we say within academia, that we're invested in social justice and equality, and right now the buzzword is indigenization and that kind of stuff, right? Well, then that means that we should begin to cite the works of those individuals because they are producing knowledges that are shaping our world.
Right.
So why are we not citing them? Why are we not giving them grants to do research?
Right.
This is another issue that we're seeing right now, particularly with the Tri-Council policy, SHARC, CIHR, and SARC, whatnot, in terms of racialized people not being, receiving enough funds to be able to do the kind of work that they need to do, right? So there's a now movement to kind of change the ways in which people are self-identifying when they're filling out those applications for funding. Now they're asking us to kind of identify our racial ethnic background and as a way to kind of see where funds are going and to make sure that the people that are getting the funds are well represented of the population of Canada.
Right.
Which is great. But I think, clearly they're seeing the issue there as well too, right? So I think that for me, if the research is sound, if the work is strong, I'm more inclined to maybe want to cite a racialized person than a white person, because for me it's about critique of power, right?
Sure.
And it's about saying we also need to give voice to people who haven't necessarily been paid attention to,
Right.
and they need to be paid attention to.
It's such a fascinating conversation, especially in academia, because we're dealing with the world where the privilege is given to knowledge and argument. Presumably, right? Presumably, the pedestal is given to knowledge and enterprise and innovation and free thinking and making a good argument and finding the right information to find the truth. And so the truth is really put on this pedestal, or at least that's what we hope is being done. And so anybody who is saying that, well, no people of any race or ethnicity or gender have a monopoly of the truth, right? And therefore it doesn't matter who wrote the paper. It doesn't matter what the name of the person is. The truth is the truth. I mean, this is the belief in the education system. But I think what you're saying is that, sure, yeah, okay, the truth is the truth, but you're missing the point of all the people who have been displaced from having access to the truth or having the ability to talk about the truth or purport or represent or argue the truth, right?
Yes.
And that we need to do a lot of work. Of course, one day we might live in some wonderful society where we aren't necessarily colorblind, but where everybody has the same chance and same opportunity in, say, academia as well as other places to argue and find out the truth. But we don't live in that right now.
Yeah.
And therefore we have work to do before we treat this as just this one pinnacle pedestal of the truth in academia. We have a lot of work to do to achieve that. But it is an interesting conversation, because to me, if I'm reading a paper, I'd like to believe that the author doesn't have an impact on my reading of it, that it doesn't matter who they are. What matters is the quality of the research. But the problem is especially in a lot of subjects, it does matter who they are. Their background does affect the research. As a white male, if I'm doing something in the social sciences, I might miss something as a result of my privilege, or I might overcompensate. I might go too far the other way in order to make my research, and therefore it's not reflective of, again, this idea of the truth, whatever this is. How do you balance this? How do you deal with this in this very traditional world of education? Education and higher education in universities have an enormous amount of tradition that needs to be overcome or respected, I guess, in some circumstances. How do you deal with this?
I think your question also kind of raises for me the paradigm war that we call it within academia, particularly around qualitative research and also quantitative research, right? Whereas quantitative is held to be, superior to qualitative research. And because the saying goes, with quantitative research, the identity of the researcher is completely divorced from the actual production of the work that they're doing, right? So we can hold it to be objective, to be true, and whatnot. Whereas qualitative research is seen to be, oh my God, filled with subjectivity and the influences of the researcher and their ideas about the world and so on and so on and so on. And I think what I say to that is that truth is something that is discursive, in the sense that it's something that we negotiate, right? There's not just one truth. Your truth here in Canada might be true here, but that necessarily doesn't transpose into the context like in Africa, for instance.
Right.
So truth is not something that is just like one thing, right? It could be many, many things, right? And we are engaging discursively, ongoing, around what that truth is and what it looks like.
Right.
I think also too, as a researcher, as a scholar, one of the things that I try to do is, particularly when I'm writing my research and when I'm producing my research, is to identify, to situate myself positionally in terms of the research, my identity and how that can also be influencing some of the ways in which I'm producing my information, my knowledge, right? And I think that's important from the perspective of like trying to be transparent about, the work that you're doing, and to let your readers also know the ways in which your own background also kind of shapes and informs the work that you're doing. And I think that's really, really important. When we don't do that, then there's questions can be raised about, does the evidence or the discussion that individual is having, does it really match up with the findings from the research that they've just produced, right? So just being transparent about that, I think, is really, really important. And quantitative research as well too. I mean, sure, you're dealing with numbers, you're dealing with data, a lot of numbers. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is no influence of your own identity in that as well. The questions that you're asking is also informed by your identity, who you are.
And there are biases in that too, right? I mean, this is in a previous episode I talked to somebody about artificial intelligence in business. And we talked a lot about how, AI is right now founded quite a bit on machine learning, which is taking data and turning it into actionable into an actionable resource. Data being the greatest resource in the world if it's overtaking oil, some people would say. And that we're using data to allow a company to operate more efficiently. We're using data for facial recognition, for example. But the problem is that the way that we perceive and construct this data has biases built in. And that many AI programs have shown that not the data itself, but the way the data is constructed is racist. That the language that we use may be racist or sexist, and we don't even recognize it until a machine shows us that by being a mirror back to ourselves that it is. And so that even quantitative research has bias in it. But there is this holy grail, I think, that 2 + 2 = 4. The George Orwell 1984 thing. 2 + 2 does not equal 5. So there is a bedrock of science and discovery that is based on, maybe truth isn't the word, maybe the word is fact. That there is the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. And if 2 + 2 = 4, then 4 + 4 must equal 8. But what you're saying is that there's a truth is negotiable. I think is actually
and I make a distinction between that and fact, because I think particularly when we're thinking about racialized experiences and the ways in which racialized bodies have experienced injustices here in Canada or abroad, right? There are certain kind of inlineate fact that we cannot dispute, right? It is true. It is fact that Aboriginal people's land was stolen, right? That's not something that is up for negotiation or discussion, right? That's a fact, and that's something that we as a collective need to kind of wrap our head around and understand and begin to make reconciliation in that regard, right? It is a fact that slavery actually also happened in Canada. For the longest time, many people thought that, there was no slavery here, but there was slavery here in Canada as well too, right? It is a fact that, there was slavery that happened in the United States. It is a fact that, there was transatlantic slavery as well too that happened, shipping of, people from Africa, Caribbean, and other places to the West, right?
Yeah.
So those are all facts, right?
Yeah.
And those are things that are not up for negotiation. But I think that in our ideas of trying to reconcile, thoughts or preconceived ideas that don't our own preconceived ideas, we might rush to the idea of saying, like, disputing other people's reality and saying, no, that's not a fact, that's not true, that didn't happen. But no, it did happen. And I think that we need to be mindful of all those and the ways in which they might actually do more damage than actually be beneficial to people.
Right. And I think the negotiation when it comes to these facts is the why and the how to make sure it doesn't happen again, or to how to build our societies in reflection of our understanding of those things that happened, whether it's slavery or racism or abuses of power in the past. That's where the negotiation comes from. So, if we're talking about the modern enterprise and dynamic and constitution of Canada, this is a truth that is to be negotiated. I mean, we would say that it's a truth because it's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that all Canadians have an opportunity should have the same opportunity to succeed. Even if they start from different places or they have different abilities, they all should have the same basic legal opportunity to succeed. We would say that that's a truth of our country. But what does that look like?
Right. The fact is that on the ground, in reality, that's actually not happening. So part of what I'm doing here is, obviously educating social workers to work on the front lines. So bringing those histories into my curriculum and teaching from that perspective, I think, is important. So if you were to take my syllabus, you'll probably see that, I have different authors or different scholars of different backgrounds,
right?
To kind of just be representative of the ideas that, or ideas and thinking that are happening around a particular issue or topic. So, and exposing my students to those kind of content, I think, is really, really important. And it begins to provide them with different lenses on social reality, right? And things that are happening to people that they'll be encountering in their own work, right? So if you have a social worker that is interested in working with Aboriginal people, well, it's really, really important that you have a good understanding of the Aboriginal history and the relationship between the federal government and also Aboriginal people, right?
Yeah.
So the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations people. So that's really, really important. And I think that to just get that kind of experience or exposure when you're already on the ground without having the educational kind of background, I think it's like, putting the horse before the cart, right? So what I try to do is just to give them that kind of information, first-hand knowledge,
right,
that they can actually take into their work and actually use that knowledge to be able to inform the ways in which they engage with people, right? Because, many of the populations that they'll be working with don't necessarily work in a linear fashion, in the sense that, in Western kind of like societies, that like, everything happens linearly. Like, you go from point A to point B and point C and so on and so on. People's lives are so complex that, you need to be kind of very fluid and very dynamic in the ways in which you are approaching those issues, right?
Yeah.
If somebody's raising an issue about, racial identity or racial trauma and how that's impacting on them, you need to be, as a social worker, you need to have that kind of contextual background and understanding to be able to understand the impact of race on those individuals specifically, but also in terms of it on a macro level, like, how does racism shapes the ways in which Canadians actually relate with one another, right? And how does it also shapes the ways in which they relate with people who are not necessarily white, right? And how does that manifest for those racialized individuals on a day-to-day basis? And then how can we leverage the power that we have as white social workers? And I say white because, again, social work is a predominantly white profession. So how can we, and it's also, gendered in the sense that there's more women than there are on the frontline level. But as you go on in terms of the administrative and, the direct, how do you want to say it, management level style of it, it becomes more masculine.
Right.
But so how can we leverage that, identity as white people to begin to kind of shift and to change the ways in which we relate and we engage with people that we're working with?
Well, I imagine it's really difficult because the first impression that someone who is working with a social worker would have would affect the next 5 years of their relationship if there's lucky to be a 5 years of that relationship, or the 1 month if that's all it's going to last, or an hour if it's not going to last long at all. And I think that the parallel that I'm drawing here is to a study that you did not too long ago about immigration in Canada and organizations that are catering to immigrants, that are helping immigrants in Canada, and how many of these organizations, or the vast majority in fact, have no real work to be welcoming of LGBTQ immigrants, right? So if someone who is gay immigrating from Nigeria, for example, or from Japan or whatever, that person doesn't look at the website of these organizations and see anything that reflects them. They see very heterosexual imagery. The language is heterosexual. And there's maybe one or two organizations that have done some work to give imagery and text and actually provide resources to people who are LGBTQ. And what's so interesting about that is that you would never think. I mean, it's just something that I bet a lot of people who work in that sector wouldn't even think of. It's something that needs to be reminded in order to be successful. So for a social worker, I imagine if you're a white female working here in St. John's, Newfoundland, and you're a social worker, there's probably a lot of cues you give off in the first couple minutes of meeting someone who may be Indigenous, for example, or a gay black man from Nigeria, that you give cues to those people that say, I'm not really here for you. I don't really understand you. And they may not be very easily understood by someone outside of it, but the person who's affected by them, immediately, they know I'm not really going to be helped by this person. Right. And is that a fair parallel?
It is a fair parallel. And I think also the importance of the study was to actually show a light, point a light to the ways in which immigrant service organizations, for instance, work within the Canadian context, not necessarily realizing the ways in which they are not, although they say they want to be, there for people who are immigrating and settling and trying to integrate into Canadian society, but they may not necessarily be conscious of the ways in which they are also being of disservice to those populations that they're interested in working with, right? So for me, for instance, and I say this, to people that will listen to me, but sometimes like when I move from one city to another city, one of the first things that I do is try to locate or identify, agencies or organizations or, social organizations or formal organizations that I can be part of, right? Or I look for the gay community, for instance, to see, how active it is and what I can participate in or join or be involved in. And so when I was coming to St. John, that's one of the first things that I also did, because I've never been to St. John's before, and I wanted to kind of just see what the place is about. And I went on the website to try to see what's happening in St. John's, and I did not really find much, right? And I make the parallel that a new immigrant that coming into Canada, for instance, and they've already arrived and they're trying to figure out what's going on in that particular society. Website, particularly because of the the fast moving pace of digital infrastructures, that's probably one of the first places that they will go to. So if they don't identify your agency as being one that is going to be receptive to them, of course, their likelihood of coming to you are one, slim, and two, if they do come to you, they're probably less likely to talk to you about real issues that is going on for them beyond just the generic immigration settlement services that you might provide for everybody else, right? And particularly for people who identify as being members of the LGBT community, that's really, really important, right? Because a lot of these people are leaving countries, in some cases, where the punishment for being same-gender loving is death. I'm thinking here in parts of Sharia law, that implements Sharia law in northern Nigeria, right? So when they come here, they want to be ensured that they will receive the kind of services that they need, right? Without having necessarily to feel shame about those kind of identities. And I think one of the major problems that we're seeing is, and it goes back to, again, power. We've been talking a lot about that today, but it also goes back to, this innocence that Canadians like to play on, even within the immigration sector services as well, too. There's this element of innocence that comes up in terms of people thinking oh, we're doing all this good work for all these immigrants that are coming in, which is, I'm not disputing that that's not necessarily happening, but it's just are we also being mindful that within all these people that we're working with, they also have complex, multiple identities that we also need to cater to, right?
Right.
So just an immigrant, a person like if I was an immigrant coming into Canada, yes, I'm black, I'm from Nigeria, I'm an immigrant, so I qualify for services, but I'm also Muslim, I'm also gay, right? So how do you help me reconcile or to deal with many of those
Yeah.
issues that I'm bringing? How does your agency help me with that, or doesn't help me with that, and how does that hinder my
Right.
relationship with your agency in
Well,
that regard?
and you're talking about it on a very real, practical ground level, but it also it raises it too to a larger level of the feeling of isolation. Like if all the websites I go to clearly have nothing to do with me, don't welcome me and anything about my identity, then I'm going to feel more and more isolated. And I've already escaped a place that made me feel isolated and persecuted. My final question for you in our last couple of minutes is related to this, and it is you just mentioned this that there are this plethora of identities, really infinite amount of identities that people can have, that we can slice and dice if we want, or we can actually look at it positively as a great diversity of identity. But you said that we need to be respectful of that, and an agency needs to cater to all of these different identities. But when there's so many, how do we do that? Is there an easy answer to this, or is it the hard answer, which is we need to do the work and have the knowledge and be educated about these different identities? And I guess my question is already betraying itself, which is, wouldn't that be too hard when there's so many different identities mixing together, even a place like this in St. John's in Newfoundland?
Well, one of the things that I'll probably say to Newfoundland is that I think obviously coming here to Newfoundland and working here, one of the things that I've also seen, particularly with trying to explain, why racialized individuals are leaving and then they're not staying in significant number, is again one of the positions that I'm putting forward is that when we're thinking about immigrant settlements and their experiences, one of the real questions that agencies need to be asking themselves is, are we doing enough to keep these people here, to help them to integrate into the community? And if we're not, then what are we not doing, and how can we begin to change that, right? Because I don't necessarily think the main argument is that people are leaving because of work. Sure, it's true that there aren't maybe a lot of work that is here in Newfoundland, Labrador for whatever reasons, and people were leaving to go elsewhere for that.
It's a purely economic issue.
But I don't think it's just purely economic issues, right?
Okay.
I think that there was a researcher here at MON that just recently produced a paper that was looking at refugee experiences, not necessarily immigrants, but refugees' experiences, because there's a difference between the two. And one of the findings that came out was around race and how some of those individuals were also experiencing racism within the workplaces, right? And I think that in Newfoundland and Labrador, that particular issue hasn't received significant attention in terms of the ways in which racism actually impacts people's experiences within the workplaces, and that might actually be a push factor for them to actually leave the province. Right. Similarly, when you have an immigrant person who identifies with many identities and they don't necessarily feel that their needs are being met, right? They will also go to there's nothing really keeping them here, right? If they don't have family or work or whatever, there's nothing really keeping them here from going to major cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, where their chance of probably receiving services are much more, there. So I think and yes, the question around multiple identities and how do we reconcile that. I think one of the things is not so much about trying to identify all the different identities, because there will always be one, right? There will always be one thing that you left out.
That's right.
But it's a question of trying to orient our own understandings and knowledges around the multiplicities of the people's identity. So when we begin from the point of view that people are so complex and they're so diverse in their experiences and they're so diverse in their identities, then and if we operate to design our programs around that difference and diversity, then that's where we begin to actually be fluid and dynamic in terms of being able to respond to those issues. It's not so much to say, okay, so Dr. Sulaimon is Muslim, so we're gonna have a Muslim service. Like, it's not really that.
Right.
It's about just being very fluid and recognizing that when your clients come to you, they may be coming with all those different identities, and your agency has to be in a place where it can actually move with where the client is going.
Well, and I think that you could apply that to the responsibility of being a citizen in this country too, that it's not just those who are running agencies or practicing social work on the ground. It's all of us who need to build a better society, and the best way to do that is not try to incorporate and cater to all of these identities, of which, again, there are an infinite number, but rather to operate fluidly and to be prepared that when I meet someone, not to have an expectation of who they are.
Because I think one of the challenges tied to that is also that there's a particular kind of heteronormative discourse that is circulating around what it means to be immigrant. There's a particular kind of imagery that we paint about immigrants.
Right.
And because of that imagery, we kind of frame our services and support around that image.
Right.
So people who are immigrants have to fit a particular kind of framework
Absolutely.
or a picture
Yeah.
for them to be able to receive
Well,
services.
and that's what struck me about your study was that, and it makes a lot of sense, because in the political discourse we talk about immigrant families because it's more of a friendly term, immigrant families. But if anyone thinks to themselves of what an immigrant family looks like, they're almost always going to see mother, father, children.
That's it.
And that's it. Not two mothers and one father and the different mothers from different relationships and all of this stuff. They're going to see mother, father, children. And that is not really doing a service to the diversity, not only of our country, but to countries all over the world.
For sure. And one other point that I wanted to kind of expound on, where we're talking about appropriation. And one of the things that also gets me about appropriation is that particularly for white individuals that are writing about other culture or, thinking about other culture and so on, is that for me, again, it's about power, right? And it's about trying to kind of give credit where credit is due. So many of the things that these white authors or white writers are writing about is not new, right? This is stuff that people who are black have been, or Asian or whatever, indigenous have been saying for so long. That we haven't necessarily paid attention to. So all of a sudden, a white person says it or writes about it, and boom, it goes viral, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like again, it's about power. How is it possible that this marginalized people have been saying this for so long, for many years, and nobody's paid attention to it, and then all of a sudden, a white person talks about racism, and whoa, we have to pay attention to that.
Yeah, it's almost like in a relationship, like you have a couple, and one person's been saying the same idea for a long time, and then finally the other person gets, oh, I got a great idea, and it's like I've been saying that for months.
Yeah.
But no, now you've had the idea, so now we're going to go with it. Okay, so, well, isn't that great?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I just think that appropriation also does, is that, it reshifts the power dynamics where it takes it away from the people who have, their knowledges have been subjugated for so long, and it repositions that power within the hands of white people to be able to kind of take the same information and use it to their advantage, whether for culturally, politically, or financially, economically, for their own advantage, right? At the expense of those people whose knowledge they've just been taken away from them. So I think, again, when we're thinking about appropriation, when we're thinking about a lot of this stuff that we're talking about today, it's really about power and who has it, who wants it, how can we negotiate it, is that possible, and how can we create a better world for ourselves going forward. So,
Dr. Giwa, this has been a fascinating conversation. There's so much more that I want to talk to you about, but that's all the time we have. Thank you again.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks so much for taking the time to tune in. Your quote of the week is from Audre Lorde. "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." Thanks for listening.